The UK's reeling after a weekend of wild weather across the country. Storm Bert caused devastating flooding in England and a major incident in Wales. Hundreds of homes were underwater, winds of up to 82 miles per hour were recorded, and at least 5 people have died. So it's very scary stuff.
So extreme weather events like this are becoming more common and more intense. Over a fifth of UK homes have suffered storm damage and 1 in 8 have had flooding in the last 5 years, according to research done by the insurance company Aviva. And with COP29 overshadowed by the re-election of a climate change denier as US president, Storm Bert is a harsh reminder that the climate crisis is literally knocking our door off its hinges.
Joining us now to discuss how the UK government can lead the fight against climate change as Trump is looming large is Tessa Khan, a lawyer and director of Uplift, an organisation that supports a fair transition away from oil and gas production in the UK. Hi, Tessa.
Hi, Coco. Hi, Nish.
From assisted dying to the climate crisis, this week's episode has got it all. If by all you mean reasons to be incredibly depressed. But Tessa, you are part of an organisation that is taking truly positive action. So back in 2023, Uplift, along with Greenpeace, took the Conservative government to court for signing off on a new Jackdaw gas field and Rosebank oil field off the coast of Scotland, claiming the decision was unlawful. The new Labour government has since withdrawn its support, but oil companies Shell and Equinor have said that they'll fight it in court. Can you briefly explain what the grounds are for this legal challenge?
The burning of oil and gas and coal are what are driving the climate crisis. Burning fossil fuels create carbon emissions, which are what changes our atmosphere and ultimately is leading to the world warming. So approving the UK's largest undeveloped oil field, which is what the Rosebank oil field is, in 2023 is completely irrational and, in our view, also unlawful. So, as you said, Uplift, together with Greenpeace, decided to legally challenge the last UK government's decision to approve Rosebank. And we're doing that on a couple of different grounds. The first is that, astonishingly, when the government approved Rosebank, it has to basically do an assessment of the environmental impact that a new oil and gas project will have. And when they conducted that environmental assessment, they didn't take into account the climate harm caused by burning the oil in Rosebank's reserves, which is the single biggest environmental impact that that field will have.
Wow.
So we think that that's crazy. Luckily, the UK Supreme Court just this summer agreed with us in a different case that it is crazy for government decision makers to approve new oil and gas projects without looking at the thing that is actually the most responsible for the climate harm within those projects, which is burning their oil and gas. So that's an argument we're making in court. This new UK government that we elected in July actually agrees with us that it was unlawful to approve the field without taking into account that climate impact. So that's great news, but we're still fighting the oil and gas companies effectively in court on that. We're also making a separate argument, which is that when the oil and gas regulator approved Rosebank, which it also had to do, it didn't actually publish any of its reasons for why they thought it should be approved. And we think that, really as a matter of due process in a democracy, we should get to see the reasons for why a massively controversial new oil field is approved. The climate impact of Rosebank is disastrous. But the thing about Rosebank is that it's also not going to do anything at all for the UK's energy securities or for our energy bills, which are, I would say, the arguments that we generally hear about why we need to keep opening up new oil and gas fields. So Rosebank's oil, like 80% of the oil that we produce in the UK, ends up being exported. So it doesn't go automatically into British cars or British homes. If we buy it back at the same international prices that anyone else in the world would be buying it from. And the companies themselves acknowledge that on that basis, it's not bringing down our energy bills. It's not any cheaper just because we make it domestically. The people who are profiting from the development of that field are the very wealthy oil and gas companies who are trying to develop it, which includes a Norwegian oil company called Equinor, which is partly owned by the Norwegian government. So effectively, we are subsidising Norwegian pensioners at the same time as British pensioners are going cold this winter.
It's like legalized mugging. Like, it's absolute nonsense. The one argument that is constantly put forward around any of these conversations around the climate crisis is that the oil and gas companies have been saying that revoking the license would cost thousands of jobs. And the north of Scotland is very dependent on oil and gas in terms of as an employer. What do you say to people who say that they're worried about job security in these areas?
So, I mean, we take the question of jobs absolutely seriously. I mean, people's livelihoods are critical. But I think, the reality that most people don't grasp is that jobs supported by the UK's oil and gas sector have actually halved in the last decade. And that's despite the Conservative government handing out hundreds of new oil and gas licenses. And that's because North Sea oil and gas is in irrevocable geological decline. Oil and gas production in the UK peaked decades ago. So regardless of how many of these new fields or new licenses you approve or you hand out, you still need to come up with a proper long-term solution for job security and livelihoods in those communities. What we do know can create long-term sustainable jobs, because we have some of the best resources in the world, is renewable energy. I mean, the UK has the second biggest offshore wind market in the world. We have the best renewable energy resources in Europe. If we get the right sets of policies to support the development of those resources and make sure that investment stays at home, jobs stay in our communities, then we can have a genuinely thriving, world-leading energy industry for decades to come. And there is no world in which oil and gas is going to provide that.
I mean, I have to say, hearing you talk about the UK on the global climate stage, I had a little feeling of, a bit of patriotic pride there. Not something I have often. Genuinely, I often wonder, where does the UK compare to other countries when it comes to climate action? I know Keir Starmer's, he was at COP recently, and he pledged to restore the UK's role as a climate leader. Are we actually a climate leader?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to remember is that leadership's relative, right?
Yeah.
So with that caveat, I guess, obviously we've seen a pretty significant shift in, I would say, rhetoric and action with the new government that we've just elected, which has been elected with the understanding that it wants to make the UK a clean energy superpower. There's a lot of polling to show that across the UK, people want the government to take climate change more seriously. They want us to go faster, not slower. It's also true that the UK has, over the last decade or so, it's done a lot to address greenhouse gas emissions. We've reduced greenhouse gas emissions by about 50% in terms of what the UK emits compared to 1990 levels. The Prime Minister's just set another very ambitious target, which is about 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emission levels by 2035. That's a good thing. They've also signalled that they won't be approving new oil and gas exploration licenses in the North Sea. That's a good thing. And also, arguably a world-leading level of ambition. There are definitely, I would say, promising signs that, as they've claimed, that the UK is kind of back in terms of climate leadership. And frankly, we desperately need it at the moment.
I think a lot of the news from COP was overshadowed by Trump's election. He's quite clear about his aims. He wants to increase fossil fuel production. He's just named Chris Wright, an oil and gas industry CEO, to be his next energy secretary. What does this mean for the UK's bid, to be a climate leader? We've got such a weird relationship with the US anyway. And I think, am I right in thinking it's not unreasonable to believe that the President of America taking this position is a significant historic knockback?
Yeah, it's definitely a bad thing. Like, I would struggle to put a positive spin on Trump's election, I think.
I read somewhere, Tessa, and I please correct me if I'm wrong, and I really want you desperately to correct me here, because I really need psychologically to be wrong about this. But I read that there are some climate scientists that argue that if Trump carries out all of the policies he says he's going to carry out on the climate crisis, it will negate the entire rest of the world's efforts on climate change in the next 4 years.
Yeah, so, I mean, I haven't read that, and that sounds hyperbolic to me, which is good.
Thank God.
And I think there are a few different reasons for that. First of all, the US isn't the entirety of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. It's, about a fifth, I think, about 20%. But, I think there are a couple of other factors at play. The first is that regardless of who is in power in the US for the next 4 years, the economic momentum behind the energy transition is real. And that is going to continue regardless of, as I said, who is president at any given moment. So the cost, for example, of solar panels has dropped by 80% in the last decade. Wind and batteries, which are crucial for energy storage, are also dropping and in price and growing exponentially in deployment. And those economic trends are here to stay. So, there are aspects of this clean energy transition that have a huge amount of momentum behind that. I think the other thing that we don't know about Trump's presidency is how he's going to respond to the fact that, Biden in the last couple of years passed a really significant package of climate or clean energy legislation worth hundreds of billions of dollars that actually invested in manufacturing and created jobs and wealth in Republican constituencies. And that was sort of a deliberate move to protect, in some ways, the energy transition from the whims and vicissitudes of politics. And so, query, I guess, how hard Trump is going to go in rolling back on benefits that actually his supporters are currently taking advantage of. But, it's ultimately true that this definitely vacates the stage in terms of global leadership for the UK to step up.
We're number one. Hypothetically, if we take advantage of the current situation, we could be number one. We could be number one.
I'll take it.
I'll take it. You can't have a conversation about climate and have an uplifting point these days. And you just gave me one. So now I have a reason to be a bit more happy with my strange existence on this weird planet. So just coming back to Rosebank, the legal challenge was given the go-ahead just a few weeks ago. What's the next steps? Are you feeling confident? Hearing you talk there, it feels like the winds of change are here in the UK. How are you feeling about the case?
I always feel good about the cases that I'm involved in, but I've been proven wrong in the past. On this occasion, though, I genuinely think, and I think it's because, as I said, the government actually agrees with us that the decision was unlawfully made. So we've just had a hearing in a court in Edinburgh. That hearing's just concluded. We're now waiting for a decision from the court, which we hope will be that the decision was unlawful and therefore the oil field won't go ahead. But inevitably, the oil and gas companies who have just gotten used to getting their way in terms of pushing these fields through, we think they're going to still try to move ahead with Rosebank, even if the court says it was an unlawful decision. And that's why we still think there's a huge role for all of us to play, as in everyone in the public, to make it clear that we don't want this dirty oil field. It's a terrible deal for the British people. All it's doing is making these unbelievably wealthy oil and gas companies richer, and, we demand better. So there's still, I think, a lot of work to do to convey that clearly.
I feel weirdly optimistic.
Yeah, I know.
It's not often we have a climate conversation that ends with me thinking, oh, the world isn't going to fucking blow up in 2 years. How important is it to push back against hopelessness? Because, especially in the wake of the Trump election and what the threat that he constitutes to our way of life, especially on the subject of climate, how important is it to push back against sort of despair on this issue?
Look, I think it's completely human to be pretty down about recent developments, including but not limited to Trump being elected. But I think that we still have a huge amount of agency in deciding what our future looks like. And there is huge amounts to play for. And especially in the UK, I will say that the oil and gas industry is in a more vulnerable position. We have changed the conversation around oil and gas in this country in a way that has never happened before. And that's the reason that this government has decided not to give out new exploration licenses for oil and gas. It's despite the massive PR machine that industry has, people are understanding that it is a profiteering industry that is only interested in its bottom line and it's not interested in doing the right thing by us. And we are in a really crucial moment for, I think, winning this fight, and we all have a role to play in it. So, I really think that, as I said, we've got a tremendous amount of agency in deciding what our future looks like.
Tessa Khan, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK.
Thank you so much for having me.